All right, just when you thought we were done talking about trials and looking at graphs and numbers, here this goes. There is an appropriate disclaimer that goes with this talk, but it's been eloquently given by Joe and Taj, which is, how to interpret these studies and different definitions and prospective and things like that. So take all these with a grain of salt, but we'll get to some meta-analyses at the end. Obviously, there's 3 different robotic systems that are currently available in the US, and some of these are available outside the US as well. I won't go into the details about the different systems, but you can take a screenshot of that if you want, because we'll mostly focus on the data. So the advantages, obviously, were that we're going to have vision out into the periphery. We're going to be able to go farther even than thin scopes, that we have precise movements and stability, and that we can integrate with what we already use, radial probe, fluoroscopy, cone beam CT, certainly an advantage for therapeutics, and one that we don't really talk about a lot, which is ergonomics. Since I've used the robot a lot, I don't go home with my arm hurting or anything like that, so it's great. So this started in 2018 when Monarch came out. Here's just a little quick bibliography if you want to screenshot that, and you can look at that on your own. But we'll hit some of the highlights. And again, different definitions of diagnostic yield throughout all of these. This is a more liberal definition here, because in this example, there were 13 cases that were atypical, but those counted as diagnostic. But as time went on, we've seen differing definitions. And so it was initially a little bit disappointing for the robots when you had average lesion size of 2.5 centimeters, but your yield was relatively low. And then the benefit trial, this was what we call now an intermediate definition. Again, decent size, but relatively low number of patients. But again, this was kind of the very beginning of the robotic literature. And so we saw for the first time we're starting to get where electromagnetic navigation was. But again, this was a little bit more of a strict definition than was used in Navigate. And then here's one that followed for a year. So we actually are able to get sensitivity for malignancy when you follow those patients for a year, which is the ideal way to do it. The bronchus sign in this one was a little on the high side when you compare that to Navigate. But what we're seeing is those diagnostic yields slowly getting higher and higher, pneumothorax rate getting lower, and moving forward there. Then jump fast forward to this year. So this year was the culmination, or actually last year technically, was the culmination of this big multi-center study called the Target trial that had been going on for a while. And in this study you could use cone beam if you wanted to, but not a lot of sites had that ability. And if you use that very strict definition, the yield turned out to be 61.6. This is still just an abstract, and we're still waiting for the final publication on this, but that's the direction that we're going with that. Then ION came on the scene about a year later, still waiting for the full publication on this. This was also just an abstract. But the exciting things that we start to see in the data is that even with very low percentage of bronchus sign, we're getting diagnostic yields, even with eccentric lesions. And this is with all the robots. Even with an eccentric lesion, when you have the ability to aim up against that airway wall and biopsy, you're getting results where previously you didn't. And remember, these studies are prior to the 1.1 millimeter cryoprobe becoming available. This was a half retrospective, half prospective comparison with TTNA, and you see the diagnostic yield is about the same. No cone beam CT scan was used. The reason that we like to do it, obviously bronchoscopically, is because we can stage the mediastinum in the same procedure. Then the cryobiopsy comes on the scene with the 1.1 millimeter probe, and we're seeing yields now push up to 90% diagnostic yield. And so when we start adding that cryoprobe in, we're going to see our diagnostic yields go up. Again, it's difficult, if not impossible, to compare these studies head to head. So it's like Joe's apples and oranges slide. This was probably the largest study that we've had thus far. From the ION side, 500 nodules. This is a group of thoracic surgeons out of Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. No cone beam CT. This is more of an intermediate definition of diagnostic yield. But the one thing we're also starting to see in these trials is that our negative predictive value is going up. particularly when you have cone beam CT or tomosynthesis, and you can go to conference afterwards with your benign diagnosis and say, hey, this is my tool in the lesion, and that's how we're going to manage it. And that's why sometimes the strict definition of diagnostic yield is actually too strict. There are truly some lesions that are just inflammation. And when you use the strict definition, you don't get credit for that. But if you look at surgical studies, there are plenty of things that we cut out, and they are just inflammation. So you have to follow those forward. And so sometimes looking at sensitivity for malignancy as you follow forward is important. But this shows what we're seeing in a lot of the robotic data is that and particularly with real-time imaging, your negative predictive value is going up. This is a multi-center prospective study from China looking at the Ion robot. Again, high diagnostic yield without cone beam CT, high sensitivity for malignancy, relatively short procedure time. This is 90 patients at 3 centers. And so when you look at this across the landscape, what we're also seeing here, despite meta-analyses that have been published by people who don't even do bronchoscopy that are telling you that you're not getting better, that is not true. We're absolutely getting better. Typically what you see is when you start biopsying smaller and smaller lesions, your diagnostic yield plummets, particularly less than 2 centimeters, but we're really not seeing that. So some of this may be the size of the catheter, and if these are the only comparisons, these are the only 2 studies that I can find when you look at a robotic catheter that's larger compared to a robotic catheter that's smaller, that may limit your ability to reach some of these lesions, at least without causing some trauma. So typically the smaller your catheter can be, the better you might be able to do on average. Again, there's certainly cases with the larger scope, you can drive it all the way to the pleura if you want. There's no head-to-head, as Taj pointed out, but there's this one that just was presented last year at AABIP, which is the same center that looked at all their Monarch data, compared it with all their Ion data when they switched over, and they found a higher yield, a lower pneumothorax rate, a shorter procedure time, less fluoroscopy, and less radiation. The big thing that you have to take into consideration is that the cryoprobe was newer, and that may actually account for the difference that you see between these two, because cryoprobe, as we've seen, is a game changer. So again, not necessarily a fair assessment there. The big change now has been this integration with cone beam CT, and again, all the systems are compatible with cone beam CT, but integration, as Taj pointed out in the last talk, whether it's tomosynthesis or cone beam CT, where that data is actually going into the robot and you're able to make real-time changes and updates, is a big change. And so we can view this data right at our fingertips during the procedure. And so that's ushered in a new era, if you will, of data where we can correct for CT to body divergence and update our target. So when we add cone beam CT scan, we can see that our diagnostic yield can go up. But not only that, but you can also see that our average lesion size gets smaller and smaller. We're getting more accurate with smaller lesions. And here we have 58 lesions. That's more than was in the entire benefit trial, all the way down to 5 millimeters, where our yield is 90% with an incredibly low pneumothorax rate. And we can see this in another publication out of UT Southwest. Again, high diagnostic yield, high negative predictive value, and very low pneumothorax rate. This is the newest abstract that's out called the CONFIRM study with Ion's full integration with their cone beam CT. This is with the CEOS platform, but they also have integration with the GE system as well. So using that strict definition, high diagnostic yield, low pneumothorax rate, and high tool and lesion. But what you're seeing, and you're going to see this in lots of different studies, is about a 10% difference between when we get our tool in the lesion and when we get a diagnosis, at least with the strict definition. And previous speakers have talked extensively about the reasons for that. So if you want to compare somewhat apples to apples, if you look at all the strict definitions, then you can see in these various trials, including the Veritas, which was with Illumicite, and that also included TTNA. So TTNA, when we actually study them on our own terms, may not be quite as good as everybody says. So when you add in real-time imaging, in general, you go up by about 5 to 10%, and those hold true even for very small lesions. And then lastly is the newest one on the block, and Taj talked a little bit about this, and obviously Kyle and Joe are here and have done a lot of the groundbreaking work with this. This was the MATCH study. This is an animal study, so take that for what it's worth, but what they're showing is that we can get tool and lesion 100% of the time with this new system. And then this is what Taj presented, the Frontier study, with, again, using that strict definition when we combine tomosynthesis so we can see tool and lesion. And again, they're tool and lesion 100%, but diagnostic yield about 10 points lower. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Again, when you're using that strict definition, some of these could be inflammatory. You may have not so great pathology. Kyle pointed out a couple examples of that before from Steve Kovac's data as well. And then this slide is courtesy of Joe and some of their data that they have as well. Looking at this, you've got 116 nodules in one study, 67 in the other. But in general, you're getting your tool in the lesion in close to 100% of the cases, and your yield is about 10 points less. Again, for a variety of reasons, as we talked about before. These are abstracts, but waiting on a full manuscript as soon as Joe stops traveling around the country and gets to writing it. All right, so let's talk about some meta-analyses just to close this. There's 3 meta-analyses all published within a month of each other. And we'll go through these quickly. Definitely some differences in here, but in general, you see some similar numbers. So this one had only 10 studies and 725 nodules. You can see the studies that were presented there. And overall pooled diagnostic yield, this was the lowest of the 3 at 80.4%. The differences that you see here are for larger lesions and when you use the cryoprobe. Big difference when you use that cryoprobe. 90% compared to 79%. Interestingly, cone beam CT scan did not make a statistically significant difference there, probably because of the relatively low numbers, but it's difficult to say. This is the second meta-analysis, which is published in JOBIP. This is the largest one, 23 studies, 1,500 nodules. You can see all the studies that were included there. This pooled diagnostic yield was about 82%, and they did break down the difference between shape-sensing robotic at 83.5 and E&B robotic at 76.8. And this is one of the ones that pulled out a few of the studies that specifically look at sensitivity for malignancy. This is when you follow them longitudinally for a year, and those numbers look pretty good at 87.6%. And very safe procedures, pooled pneumothorax rate of 0.6% in this study. Then the last meta-analysis before I finish was in Annals ATS, 25 studies. Actually, this was the largest, my apologies. 25 studies, 1,900 lesions. You see that there's a disparity of the ones that were included there at the bottom. The vast majority of these that have been published are on shape sensing with 13 studies and 1,500 lesions compared to E&B. So you have to factor that in as well. But overall, this was the highest pooled diagnostic yield for robotics. Altogether, all comers, 84%. Here the yield when you use 3D imaging is 87.6 compared to without 81.8. And then here, if you look at the E&B robotics, pooled yield of 80%, whereas shape sensing is 85%. Not a big statistical significant difference there. So in summary, we've seen improved diagnostic yields. There's no doubt about it. And it's certainly changed the way that we practice for those of us who have that. We have improved accuracy for traditionally challenging lesions that are smaller, don't have a bronchus sign, eccentric view. As Taj pointed out before, there are no prospective head-to-head studies that compare the different systems, but we looked at some of these combination prospective, retrospective single centers. In my opinion, so I'll put Taj's little exclamation point here, the addition of TOMO and cone beam is the key difference in increasing your yield. And I would also argue with an exclamation point there that the bronchus sign doesn't matter anymore. And so again, lastly, we have that gap between getting tool and lesion and getting a diagnosis. And maybe tools will make a difference. Maybe pathology things will make a difference in terms of closing that gap, but I don't ever think that it will be an identical number between tool and lesion and diagnostic yield. That's it. Thank you.